The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, but if this saying is really true, you will find out in this video. Today, we will introduce you to the living descendants of famous people from history who are still known to everyone in this century. You can expect unbelievable fates, descendants who followed in the footsteps of their famous relatives, and also people who completely ruined the huge legacy of their ancestors. So, be sure to stay tuned here at Wonderlane. Let's start with number 9, and Charles Napoleon. As you can probably guess from the name, Charles Napoleon is a descendant of the famous French general and emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, who conquered large parts of Europe and was finally defeated in the Battle of Waterloo. Quite different from his famous ancestor, who was quite small, Charles Napoleon, on the other hand, is really tall, and even otherwise, the great-great-nephew of Emperor Napoleon has little in common with his ancestor. Charles Napoleon doesn't like wars and campaigns of conquest, and has great pity for all the people who died in the battles of his ancestor. About Napoleon Bonaparte, Charles says, "He is him and I am me, and that's better for the both of us." But there is one thing that connects Charles Napoleon with his famous ancestor, and that is Charles, who has a doctorate in economics and is also a politician. He was even deputy mayor in Ajaccio, the birthplace of Napoleon Bonaparte, and currently sits on the municipal council of his hometown in France. We continue with number 8, and this young woman named Mita, who, like others, likes to present herself on Instagram. However, Mita is not just a normal influencer, but actually the great-great-granddaughter of the world-famous pacifist Mahatma Gandhi, who went down in history as the leader of the Indian independence movement. Mita Gandhi was born in the USA. She works there as a DJ and presenter, and is best known as an Instagrammer under the name Baby Hot Sauce. More than 200,000 people follow her on her Instagram channel, and Mita presents her everyday life here. Nevertheless, the granddaughter of Gandhi has not forgotten her origins and proudly shows pictures of her famous ancestor and family again and again. Let's continue with the Swedish Karin Nyman. The 86-year-old is the last living child of one of the most famous Swedes of all time, Astrid Lindgren, the world-famous author whose books such as Ronja the Robber's Daughter, Michelle from Lönneberga, or Pippi Longstocking have inspired generations of children and are still read with pleasure today. Karin Nyman, who looks just like her mother, is in fact the reason why Pippi Longstocking exists at all. As a small child, she thought up the name Pippi Longstocking when she was sick in bed and asked her mother to tell her stories about Pippi. Astrid Lindgren then not only thought up stories about Pippi and told them to her daughter, but also published them in books. With such a gifted writer as a mother, it is not surprising that Karin Nyman also started working with text later on. She first became a translator for books, but in 1965 she also began to follow her mother's footsteps and published her own books. And indeed, these were also children's books. However, Karin's own works such as I Can Drive All the Cars or I Can Fix All the Cars did not become as famous as her mother's work. On number 6 is the US-American Karen Cortell Reisman, who had a cousin that really everyone knows, namely Albert Einstein. Even though Karen cherishes the memory of her famous dead relative and owns photos and writings of him, she still has very little in common with Albert Einstein. She herself says that the only thing she has in common with him is the structure of his hair. Karen Cortell Reisman does not work as a scientist either, but is active as an author and communications coach and appears on stages as a speaker, where she teaches people how to communicate more effectively. Now we come to number 5, and a really surprising relationship, namely to the daughter of an ex-US president who is still known by many today. It's about Ronald Reagan and his daughter Patty Davis. The president's daughter works as an actress and was mainly seen in some popular movies from the 80s, such as the Pink Panther film adaptation. The interesting thing is that even though Republican Ronald Reagan is still praised by many conservatives in the US after his death, and even inspired Donald Trump to his slogan, "Make America Great Again," his daughter is not well disposed towards her father today, despite everything. In some books by Patty Davis, the actress reproaches her father and criticized her childhood. She also supports issues such as the legalization of abortion and is against nuclear weapons. Patty also proved that she is not much of a conservative in the 90s when she appeared in the Playboy magazine unclothed. Number 4 is about one of the most famous artists in the world, Leonardo da Vinci, who hundreds of years ago created works such as The Last Supper or the Mona Lisa. Only 5 years ago, a total of 25 still living descendants descendants of him could be discovered by DNA research. Among them were quite normal people like policemen, bankers, or accountants who did not know anything about the relationship to their famous ancestor, and now all met for the first time. Among them was the well-known Italian director Franco Zeffirelli, who became famous for his elaborate opera productions and award-winning Shakespeare adaptations such as Romeo and Juliet. Continuing with number 3, and from Leonardo da Vinci, we now come to the woman in his famous painting, the Mona Lisa. In fact, two descendants of Lisa del Giocondo, who was probably the model for the painter at the time, are still alive. The two Italian sisters are direct descendants of Lisa del Giocondo, and although their grandmother told them early about this connection to the Mona Lisa, the two sisters did not really believe for a long time that one of their ancestors was really the model for the Mona Lisa. Eventually, a friend of theirs who works as a historian did some research and found out that there was indeed a relationship. Let's continue with number 2 and Chris Darwin from Australia. Chris is the great-great-grandson of the famous naturalist Charles Darwin, whose theory of evolution about the origin of species was revolutionary and is still taught in almost all schools today. And although his ancestor is arguably the most important person talked about in high school biology classes, Chris himself failed biology in high school. But Charles Darwin's great-grandson later made up for this embarrassment and began a colorful and very varied life. He first earned a bachelor's degree in psychology and geography, then founded London's very first rickshaw cab service and traveled the world as a photographer. In the late 1980s, he and a few friends set the world record for the highest dinner party in the world when they hosted a dinner on Mount Huascarán in Peru, almost 7,000 meters above sea level, to raise money for a charity. Despite this crazy resume, Chris Darwin also had a lot in common with his ancestor Charles Darwin. Chris works in his native Australia in animal protection and donated money to a charity organization so that they could buy a huge nature reserve for the protection of plants and animals. Let's move on to number 1, and Matthew Freud. Matthew is the great-grandson of the famous physician and psychologist Sigmund Freud, whose research laid the foundations for modern psychoanalysis, and whose model of I, about I, and it is probably familiar to most people from school. His great-grandson Matthew Freud, now 58, runs Freud Communications, a successful international PR group in England, and has an estimated fortune of 170 million English pounds. Media describe him as the most influential PR manager in England, and he is considered a star in public relations and marketing for politics and business. Matthew Freud's clients include well-known brands such as Nike, Pepsi, and Sony, and the great-grandson of Sigmund Freud has also handled public relations for the Olympic Games. That's it for our video. Write us in the comments which descendant surprised you the most. If you like this video, please subscribe to us and give us a thumbs up. See you next time here at Wonderlane.